Picture this. September 1788. An army of 100,000 soldiers is marching through Romania, preparing to face one of history's most feared military forces, the Ottoman Empire. These aren't just any troops. They're the Austrian army of the Holy Roman Empire, led by Emperor Joseph II himself. Tension is thick. Every man knows that somewhere in the darkness ahead, the enemy is waiting. But here's the thing that makes your stomach drop. The Ottomans never showed up that night. And yet, by morning, hundreds of Austrian soldiers lay dead. Some historians claim the number reached into the thousands. The battlefield was a disaster zone of abandoned weapons, wounded men crying out in confusion, and an emperor who had reportedly fallen off his horse in history. So what happened? How does an army destroy itself without firing a single shot at the enemy? The answer involves alcohol, a linguistic nightmare and one of the most catastrophic cases of friendly fire in military history. Let me take you back to understand how this nightmare unfolded. The year is 1788, and Europe is doing what Europe does best in the 18th century, tearing itself apart through war. The Austrian Empire has joined forces with Russia against the Ottoman Turks, hoping to push them out of the Balkans and expand Habsburg influence. Emperor Joseph II isn't content to command from some comfortable palace. He wants to lead his troops personally into battle, despite having approximately zero battlefield experience. Already you can sense where this might be heading. Now, here's where the situation gets complicated. The Austrian army wasn't like modern militaries where everyone speaks the same language and follows standardized training. This was a patchwork force of Austrians, Hungarians, Czechs, Germans, Serbs, Croats, Italians, and Romanians, all thrown together under one banner. Some units couldn't understand each other even in the best circumstances. Communication was a constant challenge, and that challenge was about to become deadly. The army had been marching for weeks. Morale was deteriorating. Supplies were running low. Disease was spreading through the camps faster than any battle could claim lives. Malaria and dysentery were killing more men than Ottoman swords. The soldiers were exhausted, paranoid, and desperate for any kind of relief from the grinding tension of waiting for combat that never seemed to come. On September 17th, the massive Austrian force set up camp near a town called Karansebes, right along the Timus River. The plan was simple. Rest for the night, then continue searching for the Ottoman army that everyone knew was somewhere nearby. Scouts were sent ahead to cross the river and check for any sign of the enemy. These scouts were hussars, Hungarian light cavalry known for their speed and reconnaissance skills. What they found wasn't the Ottoman army. Instead, they stumbled upon a group of Romani people who had something far more valuable to war-weary soldiers than military intelligence: schnapps, barrels and barrels of it. Now put yourself in the position of these hussars. You've been riding for hours in hostile territory, expecting to run into enemy forces at any moment. Your nerves are shot. And suddenly, here's an opportunity to take the edge off. They bought the alcohol and started drinking. Can you blame them? But here's where the dominoes start falling. A group of Austrian infantry soldiers came across the river and saw their fellow troops having what looked like a party. Naturally, they wanted in. They asked for some of the schnapps. The hussars, already drunk and feeling territorial about their find, refused. What started as a request became an argument. The argument became a shoving match. And then, in a moment that would change everything, someone fired a gun. Think about that sound echoing across the river in the darkness. To the infantry who'd been denied the alcohol, it might have sounded like the hussars were attacking them. To the hussars, drunk and startled, it might have seemed like they were under assault. But to the rest of the Austrian camp, the 100,000 soldiers who'd been told to expect an Ottoman attack at any moment, that gunshot meant one thing: the enemy had arrived. Panic is a contagious thing. Once it starts, it spreads faster than wildfire, and it's almost impossible to contain. The hussars, thinking they were under attack, mounted their horses and fled back toward the main camp. As they galloped through the darkness, soldiers in the camp saw cavalry thundering toward them and assumed it was an Ottoman charge. Some of the fleeing troops started shouting. And here's where the language barrier turned catastrophic. Romanian soldiers, trying to warn others, began yelling, Turci, which means Turks, Turks in Romanian. But remember, this is an army where most soldiers don't speak each other's languages. The shout spread through the camp like a virus, each regiment passing it along in their own tongue, each translation adding to the confusion. German-speaking officers, desperately trying to restore order, shouted the only command they knew might work. Halt! Halt! It's the universal military command to stop. But to the Serbian and Croatian troops who didn't speak German, those sharp, repeated shouts sounded like something else entirely. Allah! Allah! To their ears, this was confirmation that they were being attacked by Muslim Ottoman forces calling out to their god. Now, imagine the scene. It's the middle of the night. You can't see more than a few feet in front of you. You hear cavalry charging, people screaming about Turks, and what sounds like enemy battle cries. What do? You fight. And that's exactly what the Austrian army did. They started fighting themselves. Artillery Commander Colloredo, hearing the chaos and seeing cavalry moving through the camp, made a decision that sealed the disaster. He ordered his artillery to fire, but he wasn't firing at Ottoman positions. He was firing at other Austrian units. Cannons began launching grape shot into crowds of their own soldiers. Infantry units, believing they were under coordinated assault, formed defensive positions and started shooting at anything that moved. The Battle of Karansebes had begun, and it was entirely against themselves. For hours, Austrian soldiers fought, fled, and fired in the darkness. Units that had been allies for months suddenly became enemies in the confusion. The multi-ethnic composition of the army, once considered a strength, became its greatest weakness. Men couldn't identify friend from foe. Orders couldn't be understood. Chaos fed on itself. Emperor Joseph II, who had wanted to lead his army to glory, instead found himself trying to stop his own forces from massacring each other. According to accounts, he rode into the fray attempting to restore order and was knocked from his horse into a stream, adding humiliation to the catastrophe unfolding around him. Even the emperor's personal intervention couldn't stop the panic that had taken hold. By the time dawn finally broke and soldiers could actually see each other, the horrifying truth became clear. They'd been fighting themselves all night. The battlefield was littered with Austrian dead and wounded. Equipment had been abandoned everywhere. 3 cannons were lost. The army's payroll chest had disappeared in the chaos. And the Ottoman army? They were still days away. Now here's where the story gets even more surreal. 2 days later, the actual Ottoman forces under Grand Vizier Koka Yusuf Pasha arrived at Karansebes expecting a major battle against one of Europe's most powerful armies. Instead, they found a town virtually undefended, with Austrian casualties scattered across the landscape and supplies abandoned in the retreat. The Ottomans couldn't believe their luck. They'd won a significant strategic victory without fighting at all. The exact death toll from that night remains disputed even today. Some contemporary accounts suggest around 150 casualties. Other sources claim that 1,000 wounded soldiers were taken to a fortress 60 kilometers away in the days following the incident. But some historians have cited figures as high as 10,000 dead and wounded, though these higher numbers lack solid documentation. Even taking the most conservative estimates, this represents one of the most devastating friendly fire incidents in military history. The aftermath was almost as painful as the incident itself. When news reached Vienna, the embarrassment was profound. How could the Habsburg army, with its centuries of military tradition, collapse so spectacularly without ever facing the enemy? Investigations were launched, though they produced mixed results. Officers were reprimanded, some were quietly reassigned, but the systemic problems remained. The linguistic confusion, ethnic tensions, poor communication systems, and leadership failures that caused the disaster were never truly addressed. For Emperor Joseph II, the humiliation likely contributed to his deteriorating health. In a letter to his brother Leopold, he'd written about the challenges of commanding such a diverse force, noting that troops unable to understand each other fell into disarray at the slightest provocation. He died less than 2 years later in 1790, his dreams of military glory shattered by the memory of that catastrophic night. But here's what makes this story so fascinating and so controversial. Some modern historians question whether the Battle of Karansebes happened at all, at least in the dramatic way it's been told. The first detailed accounts didn't appear until the 1830s, more than 40 years after the supposed event. No contemporary military dispatches mention it. Joseph II's own extensive correspondence doesn't reference such a massive disaster. How could the Habsburg Empire, known for its bureaucratic thoroughness, hide the loss of potentially thousands of soldiers for half a century? Some scholars suggest the story might have started as a smaller, real incident that grew in the telling. Maybe there was a minor friendly fire episode during the chaotic 1788 campaign that got embellished over decades into the legendary disaster we know today. Others propose it might have been invented entirely as a convenient explanation for Austrian military failures, or even as propaganda to mock the inefficiency of the Habsburg forces. Yet the story persists in military lore for a reason. Whether every detail is accurate or not, the Battle of Karansebes represents something profoundly true about warfare and human nature. It shows us how quickly things can spiral out of control when fear, confusion, and poor communication collide. It demonstrates the danger of commanding diverse forces without proper integration. It reveals how easily panic can override training and discipline. Real or embellished, this story serves as a cautionary tale about the importance of clear command structures, shared languages, and maintaining composure under pressure. Modern militaries study friendly fire incidents extensively for exactly this reason. The fog of war is real, and it doesn't take an enemy to turn a military force into its own worst nightmare. Sometimes all it takes is darkness, alcohol, and a single gunshot that sets panic in motion. The Austro-Turkish War would continue until 1791, eventually ending with the Treaty of Sistova. Austrian fortunes would improve in later campaigns, but the shadow of Karansebes, whether factual or legendary, hung over the military for years. The war cost tens of thousands of lives, most of them to disease rather than combat. But none of those deaths carried the dark irony of soldiers who may have died at the hands of their own comrades, because someone shouted the wrong word in the wrong language at the wrong time. So what's the real lesson here? Maybe it's that war, even when justified, is far more complicated than we imagine from the outside. Victory doesn't always go to the strongest army or the best weapons. Sometimes it goes to whoever makes the fewest catastrophic mistakes. The Austrians learned this the hardest way possible, by becoming their own enemy on a night when courage and preparation meant nothing in the face of chaos. And if you think this kind of disaster could only happen in the primitive conditions of the 18th century warfare, consider this. Friendly fire incidents have claimed lives in every major conflict since, including modern wars with advanced technology and communication systems. The Battle of Karansebes might be an extreme example, but the underlying truth it reveals about the chaos of war remains as relevant today as it was that dark September night in 1788. Whether the story unfolded exactly as legend describes, or whether it's a dramatic retelling of something smaller, one thing is certain. Somewhere near Karansebes in 1788, Austrian soldiers died not in glorious battle against the enemy they'd marched to fight, but in confusion and panic that turned them against each other. And that truth, about how easily order can collapse into chaos, how dangerous assumptions can be in the fog of war, is worth remembering, regardless of how many casualties actually fell that night.